Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Taylor and I had the opportunity to speak further about this question of corrections and clarifications to the PPR, and he's kindly agreed to the suggestion that he take the time now. Our lineup of cross-examination permits that. I wouldn't tell you if I thought otherwise, but we will be, I expect, fine to complete tomorrow in normal hours with this panel's evidence. So on that footing, rather than the route of an affidavit, Mr. Taylor will continue with questions clarifying PPR points. Thank you.
And I've said that I'll take 20 minutes, Mr. Commissioner, so who's ever next up can get up. And I'll try to stick to the high points that are important points that we really want to deal with. Firstly, panel, so I'm back at the PPR for another 20 minutes or so. Do you have a binder of the PPR up there? If you do, it might be useful to have it available in case you need it. Mr. Bissett will be bringing up the documents as we go, I think.
And it should be, just to help the panelists, it should be tab 1 of the biggest binder, which will be the Commission's list of documents.
Paragraph 12 says that Section 36 of the Fisheries Act prohibits the unauthorized deposit of a dilatory substance into the water frequented by fish. And then it goes on and says Environment Canada, rather than DFO, administers and enforces aspects of pollution control arising from Section 36. Now, I think there's one aspect of Section 36 that's still with DFO. Is that not correct? Sediment?
Yeah, so DFO retains responsibility for administration and enforcement of sediment-based pollution.
All right, so that's a qualification, if you like, or a correction to paragraph 12. Then if we go to paragraph 36 of the PPR, there is a reference there to, sorry, 26 I meant. There's a reference there to some of the staff, and is that just the habitat management branch, or is that the entire OHEB staff that's being referred to when it says 61 in the latter part of that paragraph?
So 61 would probably refers to all the RHQ OHEB people. If you would like a breakdown of the staff, the deck that you referred to earlier has the actual breakdown across programs, I believe.
All right, so the accurate numbers would be in that deck then, as distinct from here.
That's right.
Okay. Then if we go next to paragraph 123, it says therein that DFO does not conduct an environmental assessment under SIA where it uses non-statutory tools to manage fish habitat. Is there anything about that paragraph that needs to be clarified or corrected, any of you? And specifically whether DFO maintains engagement in an environmental assessment even where it has no statutory responsibility?
So there will be times when DFO will stay engaged in an EA or become engaged in an EA that isn't triggered by the habitat provisions of the Fisheries Act. And so an example of that could be something triggered via transport regulations that would be involved in a fish habitat issue like a marina. DFO would be providing advice as a federal authority to the regulator to say that there may or may not be issues that are pertinent to fish habitat, and would try to provide advice that would either avoid or minimize potential effects from something like that.
All right. In relation to the next paragraph, 124, even if a project is exempt from a SIA assessment, are there still implications in that to the proponent in that there would nonetheless be a review of potential impacts to fish and fish habitat?
I think that would probably speak to things or circumstances such as an urgent emergency where there's an exclusion for emergency works in SIA, and if those circumstances exist, it's possible not to go through the the process of an environmental assessment under SIA, but Fisheries and Oceans could still issue an authorization for harm to fish habitat and would use our authority to either minimize or reduce that harm, as well as to require compensation for that.
All right. The next paragraph, 125, uses the word rigor in the second line, 4 levels of types or assessment under SIA with increasing levels of rigor. Do any of you have any comment on the use of that word rigor there in the PPR?
I think it may be misused in this term in terms of screening comp studies. There's rigor in each of those levels. There's probably a different scope in terms of the kind of projects that are covered from each of those, but the rigor that goes into each of those, to me, is equivalent.
Then if you turn to paragraph 195, and 198 as well, is there anything that any of you want to say about the compliance decision framework providing guidance to both habitat management and CMP? It seems to speak to habitat management or compliance modernization rather, and doesn't speak to any other part of the organization.
Yeah, I think the point there is that the compliance decision framework provides guidance not only for the department's habitat staff, but it's also a collaborative piece with the compliance and enforcement staff. And there's guidance in there that pertains to that function and that side of the department as well.
Paragraph 223, if we could go to that next. Mr. LeBlanc, is there a comment that you have on that paragraph?
Yes, SARA listed species are in the program activity tracking for habitat system and are recorded. So I think we do not yet identify other non-SARA species, but that is in the plan in the next few years to establish that. So we do have a science table in terms of the requirements for species that have been identified under SARA.
And backing up a paragraph from that, in paragraph 222, do you have a comment or clarification about that one?
Well, I guess in a sense that that PATH itself, the program activity tracking for habitat, does not contain information to assess program performance related to no net loss. So since no one yet has determined what the data would look like in order to put that into the system.
All right. 194, if we could turn to that next, which is on page 76. There's a reference in that paragraph to habitat compliance modernization being driven by, somewhere in here, being driven by ERC, I think, Expenditure Review Committee. It's the first sentence. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, habitat compliance modernization was not driven by the Expenditure Review Committee. Actually, through the Expenditure Review Committee, while we did lose some resources in the habitat program, through the reallocation that was done through that process, we did gain some 23 or 24 new resources for habitat compliance modernization.
Thank you. Now you can see we're backing up through the PPR again. If you turn to page 70, there is a section about halfway down that page, 4.3.6, DFO practice of limiting access to SIA registry. Do you have a comment on that, Mr. LeBlanc? On that section of the PPR?
Yeah, my comment, I guess, was it's not clear the rationale for including this section and its influence on Fraser River sockeye. Further, this section is currently out of date with respect to the approach that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency advocates and should be updated accordingly.
Paragraphs 159 through 162, there's a number of statements made in the PPR as to whether DFO is doing what should be done, and it's under a heading, scope of the project under SIA. I understand that you've got some comments, Mr. LeBlanc, about these paragraphs and what they're saying and whether what's being suggested is correct.
Yeah, I would object to making the statement that the DFO scoping approach was improper and unlawful. Would suggest that that be redrafted. That our scoping to trigger is essentially the approach used by virtually all departments, and the scope of project varied based upon the nature and scope of the triggers.
All right, this being an exhibit, I don't think the Commission will be redrafting, of course, but it is important to get your points that you're making about the corrections. I understand you to be saying essentially that you view this paragraph as containing some inaccurate comments and some comments that you're taking some exception to.
Correct.
And do I understand that you're also saying that the scoping that's done is in line with general scoping practice that has occurred and continues to occur by a number of agencies?
Yes, and it has, since the Mining Watch Supreme Court decision, we are now following a new approach based on that decision.
All right, and that's a decision of about a year ago from the Supreme Court.
Correct.
All right. If you turn to paragraph 138, which is on page 57, there's a reference there to major project and not being a statutory term under SIA, and seems to be a suggestion that DFO has organized itself around major projects in relation to SIA. Do you have a comment on that paragraph or what I just said?
Yes, our definition of major project wasn't around in relation to SIA. It's built around a higher risk to fish and fish, or projects that have a higher risk to fish and fish habitat, which in most cases tend to be a major project. And it's really not related to the application of SIA.
All right, Ms. Reid?
I just wanted to add that there are other risks that could apply to a major project, such as process risk or socioeconomic considerations as well.
And then if you look at paragraph 134, there's a suggestion, and this is, I suppose, one of the paragraphs that I was referring to earlier, that this doesn't directly say it as I read it, but it alludes to DFO approving things. But with that paragraph in 133, do any of you have any comment on that insofar as it's suggestive of issuing a license authorizing a project? Is there anything more to say beyond what you've already said?
No, I think we've already made the comment that the department under the Fisheries Act doesn't authorize a project or license a project to proceed. it just authorizes the harm to fish or fish habitat.
Okay. If you turn to paragraph 128, and I've been asking these questions of Mr. LeBlanc, but if others have on the panel have something to add, jump in, and we're almost at the end. Paragraph 128 refers to DFO no longer conducting comprehensive studies. Do you have any comment on that?
I guess just a minor correction is that we do not conduct the environmental assessment. We ensure that an environmental assessment is conducted. That's our responsibility as a responsible authority under SEA. We are still responsible for, even though there is a decision for comp studies to be applied or to be led by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, we still have some responsibility for a number of comp studies, and some that were already in the process prior to the June 2010 SEA amendments.
All right, and almost finally, if you look at paragraph 123, and in particular the last sentence there, is there a comment that you have about that? Seems to suggest that DFO chooses an option rather than applying the appropriate tool. Is that an accurate statement, or is there any clarification to make?
Yeah, I think that's the point, that we apply the appropriate tool depending on whether impacts have been mitigated. And so then the choice is either no authorization being required versus the need for an authorization if impacts cannot be avoided.
All right. And then finally, and then I think I can leave it there for this PPR, if you turn to paragraph 113, and you can have a moment to look at it if you want, the first sentence might be suggestive that there is a direct linkage between SEA and the department's authority in managing Fraser sockeye. Is there any comment to make about that?
I think our perspective there is that there are circumstances where a project could be exempt or otherwise not requiring an EA under SEA. So it's not to say that it would always apply. It would usually apply, but there may be circumstances where it doesn't. There are exclusion regulations, or there may be, or exclusion lists, or there may be regulations that that exempt a particular activity or project from SEA.
All right. Is there an explicit relationship or direct linkage between SEA and DFO's authority? I may be confusing you.
Well, I would say that SEA is inclusive of the determination of impacts on fish and fish habitat. So the areas that we look at and we can control under the environmental impact assessment are those that are within the purview of the federal government's responsibility, and habitat is one of these areas. Irrespective of whether SEA would proceed, the Fisheries Act applies. So it's an integral part of the environmental assessment process is a determination of impacts on fish and fish habitat. So,
But you're not dependent on SEA?
no.
All right. Thank you. I think I can leave them there. Thanks very much. Those will be my questions then, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you. I have Mr. Harrison for the Conservation Coalition. I expect he will not finish before 4, but can at least use that time to cover some ground. Thank you.
For the record, my name is Judah Harrison, Harrison, and I'm here on behalf of the Conservation Coalition, which is a 6 not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations, and one individual sitting in the audience, Mr. Otter Langer, who worked for you guys for 25 years and finds this topic to be very important. So I'm here representing him, and I hope to do my best in that capacity. I wanted to start very briefly and very, take a step back a little bit. And I'll start with you, Mr. Wong. It's quite clear from all these documents that there has been changes, pretty significant changes in the last 10 to 15 years. I'm thinking with respect to staff numbers, with respect to enforcement numbers, a lot of these things. And I understand that you've been working for the department for over 15 years, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I just wanted to generally, or maybe I'll even give you some particulars, but I'd like you to discuss changes in the last 15 years that you've noticed. A couple of particulars I'd like you to get at, it would be, number one, do you have more or less staff now to do enforcement or monitoring or all of the above? Number two, do you have more or less managers overseeing you? And so when I'm thinking of you asking you to compare staff, I would like, within your on-the-ground staff. And I mean, I don't want to rush through and give you a bunch, so let's just start there.
Sure. So the first question, as I understood it, was, do I have more or less staff now than I've had in the past? And that, it depends when you want to draw your line from the past, because our staff numbers have varied over the years since the time, I guess, first of all, when I started working for the department as a operational biologist, and then when I became a manager. But in general, I would say, I'll give you this response, and if you want more detail, feel free to ask for more. But the numbers we have now are roughly the numbers we had when I first started with the department. They're in our area. There's probably a little bit more than what we first started. But in between then, we had an expansion where we had quite a few more staff. And so we kind of started at a level that's close to where we're at now, went up to quite a few more, and then we've come back down to where we're at now. And I might be able to dredge up some specifics, but that's a rough indication.
Yeah, that's fine. And in fact, I think there are specifics in the PPR, which I do not have in front of me now, but that's fine. And the second question was with respect to management. Do you feel, I mean, I guess you are a manager now, I've heard, in the regional area, but in general, is there more management staff now than there was 15 years ago?
I'm not sure. Earlier in my career, I paid less attention to what was going on above because I was really more operationally oriented and field oriented. I would say it's my impression that there is more management oversight and more direct need for us to explain and rationalize our decisions. There's less independence, I'll call it. Whether that translates to more managers or not, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. I guess the third, in the same vein, do you feel that there's a significant difference or a noticeable difference in the amount of time that not management, but your employees spend in the field as opposed to in front of a computer, let's say? Do you feel that 10 to 15 years ago there was much more people with boots on their feet and in the fields?
Yes, that's my impression. I'm just trying to think back. I bet you 15 years ago, not everybody even had a computer.
Yeah, they were playing Pong.
Yeah, but the program in terms of the operational habitat side of the program has become much more accountable to process, and there has been process added on to the program in the years since I first started. For instance, when I very first started, there was no Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And then that came along and it brought with it a regulatory and process workload that we had to add on into the program. Nowadays, there is the Species at Risk Act, which isn't brand new, but the species are just starting to get listed and the prohibitions are starting to be put into place. And that's another thing that we have to add on. During that time, the consultative obligations and expectations, both public in general and First Nations specifically, have been evolving almost constantly and very, very rapidly at times. So all of this has brought much more, I'll call it process obligation to our actual habitat management biology work.
Thank you, and I guess we have heard comments to that and the increasing complexity under which you operate. I wondered if maybe you can attach some numbers to that. I think anecdotally we hear that 80% now of staff's time is dealing with regulatory compliance, I guess they say, or referrals of the major projects. Is there a chance that you can put in numbers, I mean, the percentage of your staff now that are out in the field versus percentage that they would have been 15 years ago? Are we talking half the time?
I'm not sure I can relate it that way. We do undertake some what we call work planning within our operating unit, where we had recognized that there was this increasing pressure to attend to these process issues. And the result of it was that our staff were less and less available to be in the field. So we intentionally brought out these work planning principles that looked at the work roughly along the lines of the strategies in the habitat policy and said, okay, we should do some regulatory work, and that will necessarily probably be the biggest portion of our work plan. But we're going to do some monitoring, we're going to do some education and outreach, we're going to do some basic even administrative stuff that you have to do as part of the bureaucracy. So we tried to set up a plan that had some balance, with roughly 45% of our idealistic work plan being tied to regulatory things. But even that regulatory work doesn't just mean sitting at your desk typing on a computer. That includes doing the field visit to look at a site beforehand. It includes looking at a site perhaps during or after the works are conducted. So it's a bit hard for me to extract how much are our staff in the field versus how much compared to what it was 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you. I will not push you then. I'm hoping, Mr. Registrar, that you can bring up a commission document. And this is the 1986 policy itself. It's exhibit, darn, chose the wrong page. 260,
I think.
Thank you, Rob. If you could turn to the page is cut off. Chapter 4 of this document. Looks like it's... yeah, one page before that, please. And if you can... That's the one. So number 4, if you could highlight number 4 there, please. Thank you. I guess I'll just read out the first line of number 4, but it says, in jurisdictions where Fisheries and Oceans manages the fisheries and in recognition of the need to avoid cumulative habitat losses caused by small projects, the department will participate with the province, territories, and other federal departments in reviewing plans for activities regulated by other levels of government. Where was getting to the point that I wanted to? Well, I guess the point that I wanted to get at was cumulative impacts with respect to smaller projects. And the point that I wanted to say was, would you all agree that the 1986 policy itself recognized that cumulative impacts is a serious concern and that small projects have a known tendency to lead to cumulative impacts of fish habitat?
Well, I would agree with that. I wouldn't say necessarily that all small projects cause an impact, but there's certainly the possibility that they can, and when you get a lot of them, the probability that some of those will have an impact increases. And it's been my observation and experience that that is the result that's happening now.
And I guess along the same lines, would it be accurate to say that some major projects, and I put quotations around that, would have a less harmful impact on fish habitat than some smaller projects? The size of the project does not necessarily determine the amount of habitat destruction. I see some nods, and I'd appreciate it.
Certainly, I can say that operationally. Like, as an example, a major project could be a wind farm.
Yeah.
And the wind farm could be in an absolutely upland area, and it may have environmental consequences, but they're not particularly related to fish and fish habitat.
And Mr. LeBlanc, you were nodding in agreement?
Correct.
Thank you. I only have 4 minutes left, and so I'm hesitant to start on a subject of EPMP, but I guess just generally right now, EPMP, we've heard, it focuses on major projects. And put in other words, not only does it focus on major projects, I believe, is it fair to say that it will not address smaller projects, that under the EPMP, DFO will not address the vast majority, I'll put a small qualifier there, will not assess the majority of projects that impact habitat?
First of all, the EPMP wasn't just focused on major projects. It had habitat compliance modernization, partnering, the application of a risk-based approach to either large major projects or small projects. We developed a series of operational statements to be used to streamline the regulatory process, but we still do quite a large number of small referrals a year across the country. The number is approximately 7,000. We've reduced it over the last number of years, but we still review a large number of projects, and we have a large number of smaller projects reviewed through agreements with provincial agencies that have standards that are equivalent to the requirements we have.
So then I guess the question directly would be, would you say that there are more smaller projects that are assessed or more smaller projects that are not assessed by DFO currently under the EPMP?
The EPMP was part of a continuous improvement initiative, and we are now, because of the risk management framework and the tools that we developed, such as I mentioned, operational statements, we do review less projects than we did, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess, is it fair to say that the majority of smaller projects, projects not deemed major projects, are not assessed in any capacity by DFO? Is that a fair statement?
I'm not sure I followed your question. Could you reframe that?
Is it fair to say that the vast majority of smaller projects that impact habitat are not assessed by DFO in any manner currently?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. What DFO has done is taken what you might consider the lowest of the low end of the risk category of projects and said, we're going to try to deal with those in I'll generalize, a more streamlined way through things like operational statements. But there are still lots of projects that come in that you would classify as relatively small that DFO staff still review and make some assessment of. So I'm not sure that it would be accurate to frame it as most small projects don't get looked at now. There are certainly some, and there are definitions for what those are. Some of those do bring some risk to the resource, and some of them probably don't, and they're dealt with through these streamlining tools. But there is still review of things that I think the department thinks pose some degree of risk for a negative consequence. So we're looking at less stuff than we used to.
Yeah.
But I don't think
You still think you're catching most?
Well, I'm not sure I'd say that either, because one of the corresponding challenges has been over, say, the last 3 to 5 years, a tremendous increase in economic development activity, and that has brought more bigger projects, more medium projects, and more smaller projects through. So there is some concern that even to the scale of projects that we're not looking at, there are more of those coming through just by way of more economic development activity.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day, and we resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Council, I'll remind you that there's the 9:15 meeting tomorrow.